Hello and welcome everyone. We're so excited for you to join us. Today we're featuring an in-depth conversation and a virtual tour of ISAR's exhibition hosted by the NYU Alumni Association and NYU's Institute for the Study of the Ancient World. My name is Michelle Lubchich and I'm the Assistant Director of Special Events. On behalf of NYU, we just wanted to thank you so much for joining today's special presentation. Now, before we begin today's session, we just want to let you know that we hope everyone's doing well, that your family and loved ones are safe and healthy during this time. And we're so thankful that you've chosen to spend your afternoon with us. So today's audience, it was so fun receiving your chats. We have everyone representing the world, which is from the USA, from China, from Canada, from the UK. And that's what makes NYU such a special place. It's created a community from all over the world to connect and reconnect with each other, a place where everyone feels welcomed. Today's session features my co-host, Iris Fernandez, Development Associate at ISA, and our main presenter, Clare Fitzgerald, the Associate Director for Exhibitions and Gallery Curator at ISA, who is also a graduate of NYU. If you have any questions during the presentation, please send them in the Q&A box and we'll get to as many questions as we could at the conclusion of the program. Again, thank you so much for joining us. Now it's my pleasure to welcome my wonderful colleague and co-host today, Iris Fernandez. Iris, take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all for tuning in today, and thank you, Michelle, for setting this all up. I just want to remind everyone that you are welcome to submit the questions, encouraged to submit the questions via the Q&A button, and we'll get to as many as possible at the end of Clare's presentation. For those of you who don't know, ISA is a graduate school and research institute of NYU, located in the Upper East Side of Manhattan by the Metropolitan Museum of Art and NYU's Institute of Fine Arts, in case anybody's more familiar with them. We are also very proud to have our exhibitions program, which brings everyone here today. We usually put on about 1 to 2 exhibitions a year that are regularly covered by the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Hyperallergic, and more. So please, whenever we're all able to be together in person again, come check us out anytime. As the most visual and public part of ISA, our exhibitions play a crucial role in furthering ISA's mission to foster interest in and understanding of the interconnected civilizations of antiquity. With this in mind, our recent Spring 2019 exhibition, which is what we're covering today, called Hymn to Apollo, the Ancient World and the Ballets Russes, explores both the role of dance in ancient culture and the influence of antiquity on the modernist reinventions of the Ballets Russes, the groundbreaking dance company founded in Paris by Sergei Diaghilev. Though I leave the full explanation to my colleague, Clare Fitzgerald, the Associate Director for Exhibitions and Gallery Curator at ISA. Clare came to ISA with a background in both curatorship and education. She holds a PhD in art history from Emory University. As an Egyptologist, she has a particular interest in the definition of space through image and identity in funerary culture. She has held a number of fellowships, including at the American Research Center in Egypt and the Metropolitan Museum of Art. She has curated exhibitions and permanent installations on a wide array of topics and collections, both ancient and modern, and teaches museum methodology and practice at ISA. So, without further ado, I will hand it over to Clare as she takes us into the galleries.
Thank you so much, Iris, for that really kind introduction. And once again, I want to thank everybody who is here today. One of the benefits, the silver lining, I suppose, of the situation that we find ourselves in is that we are now able, usually we can only talk to you about the material that we have in our galleries, but now we can sort of look back at some of the material that has already left our galleries, but that made a big impression for us and that we really enjoyed working with. So that's one of the things that we're doing today with our exhibition, which ran at the Institute in the spring 2019, called Hymn to Apollo. So I will just start right up. I want to begin by giving people a little bit of an overview of how this exhibition came about. And in doing that, I'm going to kind of introduce you to our space. At ISA, we're on 84th Street. We have 2 galleries. They're non-contiguous. So we kind of create 2 different environments in which to explore material. And this is what you will see when you come see us. This is our sort of entryway, in an effort to kind of give you a sense of space, which we unfortunately can't be in right now. ISAW is founded on the idea that the study of the ancient world is made stronger by collaboration across disciplines. And that really comes from a desire to sort of break down divisions that exist between geographical areas, chronological areas, and sort of look at the ancient world as an interconnected place. One of the ways that we can do that is not only looking at the way in which information material moved in the ancient period itself, but also how that material moves into our modern world and how it informs what we create, what we do, and how we think about things. I think one of the things that is really apparent to all of us who are scholars of the ancient world is really that what we see in the ancient world, the questions that we ask of the ancient world are very much a portrait of our own experiences, our contemporary experiences. We look to the ancient world often to explore ideas that are meaningful to us today, and therefore in each period the questions that we ask are different. So they inform, we can learn not only about the ancient world but also about ourselves through those types of inquiries. So in this exhibition, what we're doing is we are taking as our starting point the Ballets Russes. The Ballets Russes, as Iris mentioned, was a ballet company, but really so much more, and I'll get into that, which began in 1909 in Paris. As you can probably tell, the Ballets Russes, Russe refers to the fact that most of the people who were initially involved in the Ballets Russes, including its founder Sergei Diaghilev, were Russian citizens, most of whom sort of gathered and worked in Paris. The Ballets Russes actually never performed in Russia, and therefore they were kind of this itinerant group of creative people that worked across a whole bunch of different media. So their lifespan and their initial iteration is rather short. They began in 1909, and with the death of Diaghilev in 1929, they sort of transitioned into later iterations and things changed, but we really focus on that first version of the Ballets Russes. In doing so, and I'm just going to switch to give you a sense of what our first gallery looked like with this installation. In doing so, I'm going to give you a very brief background of the Ballets Russes itself. The Ballets Russes was founded by an individual named Sergei Diaghilev, who was a figure who sort of defied simple characterization. He was himself, he actually spoke quite openly, saying, "I myself have no talent." He also describes himself as a charlatan, as charming, as cheeky, but he was really a showman. And the thing that was his real talent, he professed it himself, was that he was a connector of people. And he was able to draw together a really spectacular group of visual artists, dancers, musicians, composers in Paris at this extremely vibrant time, but a time that was also, of course, difficult. The early 20th century was a time of incredible social change, political change, artistic development. And so when you look at the history of the Ballets Russes, although it's just these 20 years, you see the names of people who will be familiar to almost anyone. So collaborators included Picasso, Matisse, de Chirico, we have Coco Chanel involved, Michael Fokine, Balanchine, we have dancers, of course, like Anna Pavlova and Nijinsky, and and composers like Stravinsky and Prokofiev. So all of these creative people were coming together, and their goal was to create something that surpassed dance. It surpassed ballet. It was some total work of art, an idea encompassed in the German word Gesamtkunstwerk. So sort of something that brings all of these different media together and becomes something greater than the sum of its parts. Now, in order to do this, they drew very widely, both aesthetically and philosophically. This exhibition focuses primarily on their engagement with the ancient world, principally the Greco-Roman ancient world. They certainly were interested in sort of Russian prehistory, but the material that they were drawing from was less archaeological. They also had great interest in early India, various other Southeast Asian cultures. So they drew very widely, but our exhibition focuses mostly on their engagement with Greece, Rome, and Egypt, and it's kind of common to see why. Another thing that's foundational to understanding this material is that archaeology was the news of the day in the early 20th century. So whereas, some of us, at least, if we hear about an archaeological discovery, we might not hear about them all that often, and it might be a little blurb here or there, but the work of archaeology in this period was something that was sort of part of popular culture. And so it had an impact that perhaps is a little bit different than the one that we might think of today. So with that, we kind of head into the galleries. So the first question I think that we need to approach is, what do we know about dance in the ancient world? This might seem a really obvious question, but of course, one of the things that being somebody who studies the ancient world, but something that happens a lot, at least I can say in my own personal experience, is that when I tell people that I study ancient art or ancient culture, they say, oh yeah, but we already know everything about that, right? We're kind of sorted on that. And of course, for those of us in the field, we're constantly developing, we're constantly looking at old things again, or finding new things. And one of the things that is really important to highlight whenever we talk about the ancient world is sources. What are the sources that we have to know about certain aspects of the past? Dance and music, we understand to be both in a social way and in a ritual religious way to be foundational to ancient Greek and Roman culture. We know that through texts that refer to various festivals and sometimes reference dances, and through images that we see of people dancing. But the images that we see are very specific, and we'll get into that in a minute. So when we look at this beautiful piece, we're just going to start with this wonderful skiffos. It's like classical, and on it is this beautiful figure of a female dancing. She's throwing her head and arms back in sort of ecstatic dance. And this makes us wonder, sort of, who were the dancers? What did they dance? What was the music like? All of those questions. And of course, the thing that we understand is that dance and music are lived arts. They are something that you experience. And while we now often have methods of recording those ephemeral experiences, we obviously do not have that in ancient Greece and Rome. There may have been, and there's a very late example of some musical notation in the ancient world, but that comes actually quite late in our ancient story. And so we don't know what music sounded like for the most part. We can, using archaeologically excavated objects or images of objects, we can maybe approximate the possibility of the sounds that they were able to make. But in terms of questions of melody, we're really kind of at a loss. Also, we don't have dance notation from the ancient world. What we have sometimes is a reference to the name of a dance associated with a certain ritual, but we don't have the sort of descriptive, the descriptive language that says, and this dance looked like this, and then we did it then, and these are the people who participated. And so there's a sort of a big hole in this type of information that we have about dance in the ancient world. I thought quite ignorantly when we began this exhibition, since my part is really more the ancient part, I thought, oh, we're going to be dealing with Ballet Russe. We're going to have so much video and so much information. We're just going to be awash in it. And what I found very shortly was that many of the holes that we have in the record of ancient dance actually do exist for the Ballet Russe, and I'll get into why that is in a minute. But at this point, I'd like to highlight the fact that one of the wonderful things about working across so many disciplines at ISI is that we're able to collaborate with really fantastic scholars from all different areas. And so I want to thank my co-curator, Rachel Hirschman, as well as our Ballet Russe specialist, Lynn Garofalo, who is a professor of dance at Barnard, and whose book, Diaghilev's Ballets Russes, is a really fascinating treatment of all of this. So if you're looking for more on that, I'd highly recommend that. So what we see in images from the ancient world, again, are not descriptive. They are evocative, probably more than anything. And the people dancing in ancient images, ancient Greek and Roman images, are a very specific group of people, which I'll get into in a minute. But if you are a dance person, there's a figure who you might think of immediately when you think of the ancient world and modern dance, and that is Isadora Duncan. Isadora Duncan was a California-born American dancer who spent most of her career in Europe. She, like many at the time, were looking into the ancient world sort of, and seeing in ancient Greece in particular, an idea of something natural, of something pure, of something that hadn't been sort of influenced by the complexities of the modern condition. And instead of engaging in a very rigorous, sort of controlled type of ballet, which was sort of the type of the time, she was looking to sort of, through improvisation, through sort of organic movement, to explore something very different through dance. And she herself, would wear sort of Greek-inspired costume, as you see here. Here she is in an amphitheater in Athens, dancing in the amphitheater, And so she was a very important figure in the early development of the Ballets Russes. Another really important figure who we're going to talk about it again and again is a man named Leon Bakst. So I said that a lot of the names associated with the Ballets Russes are people who you probably have heard of at one point or another. Leon Bakst is maybe not that person, but he was an absolutely critical figure in the aesthetic development of the Ballets Russes, as well as the sort of philosophical development of the Ballets Russes. He was a Russian-born artist who began with the Ballets Russes right at the outset, and he drove not only set design but costume design, and we'll return to him again and again. But he and Michael Fokine, who was the first choreographer for the Ballets Russes, saw Isadora Duncan when she performed in Russia. And what I do love about working with modern people is we have their letters, which can sometimes be a little snarky. And Bakst writes that they saw Isadora Duncan and he said, what she's doing is hugely important and very meaningful, but she dances like a crazy Amazon. So he thought that what she was doing was really important sort of in the big picture, but he was not so enamored by her actual, talent as a dancer. You don't get stuff like that as much in the ancient world, at least not into the Roman period. So what were people looking at when they looked at dance in the ancient world in this period. One group of material they were looking at are figures like the ones you see right here. There are two types of figures, but their distinction is somewhat academic. But these are small terracotta figures which represent dancers. They're usually found in funerary deposits and depict young, mostly women, sometimes men, dancing. These, they're often referred to as tanagra figurines, and they were thought to be, initially, they were thought to be images of regular, quote unquote, regular people dancing. So of course, one of the questions that was coming in the early 20th century was sort of a desire to move away from the sort of royal, high elite culture and look more at the way in which real people danced, conducted themselves, what they were producing. And so when artists were looking to the ancient world, they saw figures like this and they said, oh, this isn't sort of mythical people dancing. This is regular people dancing for fun. Now, that reading of these figures may not be accurate, but that's a little bit immaterial because that is how they were being used at the moment. The other thing that was really important about these figures was not only the dynamism that they showed real movement, but also the way in which garments were used, the way in which the drapery sort of worked for these pieces. And I'll get back to that more in depth in a moment. But this goes back also to this idea that archaeology was something that you would read about in the regular paper. And so these figures, in Paris, there was what they called a tanagra mania, where people loved these figures so much. And then there was also fashion that, was meant to, dresses that looked like those that are on tanagra figurines. And so these had sort of a real cultural traction that perhaps, again, we may not always experience today. So we can see how some of this translates, sometimes quite literally, into images for the Ballets Russes. So Leon Bakst and the other collaborators of the Ballets Russes were highly interested in archaeology and in ancient text. They all, spent time at the Louvre and also to some extent the British Museum. And we have lots and lots of sketches and anecdotes that take place within museums. Bakst himself also traveled to Greece and Crete and did a ton of sketches, and we're very fortunate to actually have many of his sketchbooks in the collection of the New York Public Library, which we're able to bring into the galleries themselves. So we can see kind of where some of this material was coming from, and then how it was sort of translated into something different. So Duncan, Bakst, and everyone in the Ballets Russes were very clear that they were not seeking to recreate the ancient world. They weren't seeking to one-for-one recreate dances. What they were seeking to do was take something of the sort of spirit of that, that artistry and transform it into something very modern. So here we have, on your left, we have one of these Tarentine figurines. And then on the right, we have one of Bakst's watercolors, which is a preparation for a set design of one of the ballets called Daphnis and Chloe. So here you can see there's almost a one-to-one sort of translation of this figure into watercolor. And why I bring this up is that we have not only sort of the drapery and the figure translated, but also even sort of the gesture. And so, so we can see how there's sort of a evocative nature to Bakst's work. Leon Bakst is sort of the unsung hero, in my opinion, of much of this material. and what's wonderful is that we do have so many pieces of his that are working documents. So we see his own process in a way that we often aren't able to. We see what he's sketching in the museums. We see what he's reading, because he writes a great deal about the way that he feels about the ancient world and what it draws up in him. He talks about what is, how he's responding to archaeological finds. And then we see a piece like this, which is one of my favorite pieces in the exhibition. And it's costume design for Daphnis and Chloe. And what you can see here is he's drawn the figure, and he's even sort of drawn the figure with a very sort of, she almost looks, her face almost looks like a classical Greek sculpture. But you can see that she has all this billowing drapery that's very gauzy, very diaphanous. But you can see, I love that he's written, the black dots are white at the exclamation point, and then here he sort of thought about this billowing fabric that's going to come out, and then he crosses it out. So you really see how he's working through these ideas, and again, creating something new. In order to represent costume, which is so important, in another thing that's important to remember about the Ballets Russes, and this is going to probably cause some reaction, is that outside of a 30-second video that was unauthorized of an outdoor rehearsal of the piece Les Sylphides, there is no video, there's no moving picture of the Ballets Russes. And in addition, there's no moving picture yet found of Nijinsky dancing. Now, almost every time I say this, someone says, no, I've seen Nijinsky dancing. And I can only say this with such confidence because of the work of Ballet Russe scholars has affirmed this. But this got to the point where even when I was walking once with my father, and he is not interested in dance or the ancient world, I said this to him, and he said, no, but I've seen Nijinsky dance. So maybe my father has seen Nijinsky dance in some dream of his or something. But and there's a reason for this. So Diaghilev did not allow film of Ballet Russe performances or anything of that sort, in part because, for a couple of reasons. In part because he believed that it diminished the sort of experiential nature of a performance. And the other side of it is quite straightforward. He also was concerned about losing revenue if any of that sort of material got out, because Diaghilev was both sort of, again, a creative director, but also someone who was very much engaged in how to keep the Ballets Russes going. This was an incredibly expensive enterprise, and he was constantly involved in trying to up the showmanship, up the drama, up these things that would keep this wonderful company going. So in the exhibition, we really wanted to make sure that we had some costumes, because the body and giving a sense of sort of how the pieces might have moved was so important. So this piece we borrowed all the way from the Dance Museum in Stockholm, and as you can see, it's a costume for a nymph from Narcisse. And what you can see here is, of course, the sort of running vine pattern, which evokes, patterns that we see very frequently on pottery. And you have the sort of peplum that also looks a lot like ancient clothing, ancient women's clothing. But the thing that I just want to bring up too is that this is made of just one piece of silk. You can see that the hem is sort of double. That's the only piece. So it is so fine and so delicate. I just wish that we could have seen this in motion, because you can imagine how this would have just sort of whispered over the body as the person moved across the stage. And it's just, in person, it just is such a striking piece. So we're very fortunate to have it in the gallery. So we have this sort of interest in costume. But the ancient world also influenced the way in which movement, those in the Ballets Russes thought about movement. So remember that most of these dancers are coming from a very traditional training in ballet. Trained in Russia, in the state schools, where there was a lot of emphasis on footwork. There was a lot of emphasis on this sort of verticality of the body. And in addition to these being principally usually corseted, for women, corseted tutus, you can see how the sort of costumes that Bakst is introducing create a totally different silhouette. But also they allow the body to do many different things. You no longer are sort of wed to this columnar type of movement. Instead, the body can twist and turn and move in a way that's much more organic. Here we have an image of Nijinsky in the title role of Narcisse, and you can see, of course, his costuming references ancient Greece, but also I want you to focus on sort of that movement that we see him engaging in. And what's so fascinating, I think, about Nijinsky, or one of the things that's so fascinating about him, is that the descriptions of his dancing are electric. People speak in terms that his stage presence was just magnificent. His power as a dancer was sort of unparalleled. But again, we don't have any images or any moving images of what he danced, how he danced. And so what I want to turn to here is this is one of my favorite exhibition objects, and it is a Roman sculpture of a satyr turning to look at his tail. So you can see this beautiful torsion in the body that is something that we see coming in more in the Hellenistic and after. And you see that the Ballets Russes was drawing on these organic sort of movements, but that are very elegant. And so, we just love this. So another idea that the Ballets Russes collaborators were really interested in was the tension between Apollo and Dionysus. So in the ancient world, Apollo and Dionysus are half-brothers, the sons of Zeus, and they represent sort of the two aspects of people. Apollo is the sort of controlled aspect of ourselves, reasoned, controlled, not governed by emotion. And then you have Dionysus, who of course is the god of wine, of revelry, and sort of engaging with all those things that are more sort of wild. So in the ancient world, those sorts of two figures are seen in tension with one another, but and that idea is carried on. And so what we see here in this piece is this is actually the same vase, but they're two different sides. So on one side we have Apollo and Artemis, that's on the left, so you can see sort of the more up and down straight characters. And then you have Dionysus and a Maenad. Maenads and satyrs were Dionysiac creatures, these sort of wild women, and usually half man, half goat, half horse, and they're sort of in Dionysus's entourage. And so you can see that these two types of figures are on opposite sides of this vessel, which would allow someone to sort of investigate that idea of, the Apolline nature or the Dionysiac nature. What is that tension that we all have in ourselves? And so one of the things that we see in these, in ancient, particularly in ancient vessels and ancient friezes, things like that, is that we see Dionysiac figures dancing. They're often Maenads, satyrs, musicians. And so going back to that first object we talked about, that Skyphos is a Maenad. She's not a regular woman, she's a Maenad. So she has this sort of mythical cloak around her, which allows her to dance wildly and do all of those sorts of things. And so that idea is picked up by the Ballets Russes through, often to some degree, through the work of Nietzsche. So Frederick Nietzsche writes The Birth of Tragedy, and it's published in 1872. And in that piece, he talks about Athenian theater as being sort of the height of human production, and that this sort of tension between the Apolline part of ourselves and the Dionysiac part of ourselves is what creates art, is what it's that thing, it's that sort of rubbing together that creates everything creative. And so we see that really manifest in a work called Afternoon of the Faun. Afternoon of the Faun was choreographed by Nijinsky and performed by Nijinsky. What we're seeing here is a photo. It is not a performance photo. It's actually a studio photo that by Adolf de Meyer. And Nijinsky actually paid to have these photos taken himself. This was not done by the Ballets Russes. This piece was so important to him that he wanted it sort of memorialized. So we can see here, we have Nijinsky as the faun, and he is sort of a naughty faun, and there are some nymphs who come to have a bath. He sees them, he's enamored with them, they run away, all but one. One leaves her scarf, and ultimately he concludes the piece by sort of satisfying himself with the scarf in a sort of graphic manner, which shocked audiences of the time. Now, how does this relate to the classical world outside of sort of costuming? Well, one thing is the choreography. Nijinsky was very enamored of ancient art, and in fact there's a story that he was to meet a friend in the Greek galleries at the Louvre, but was late because he was so enamored by some Egyptian reliefs, so the flatness of those reliefs. So what they did here was brought the backdrop way up close to the edge of the stage to flatten the performance plane. And then the choreography was very flat. It moved in a lateral way across the stage in order to kind of reference or approximate that sort of the flatness of the movement in those works of art. And so, but also, of course, faun is a great manifestation of, you know, are we more Dionysiac? Are we more Apolline? How does our sort of struggle with that go? So to give another example of what they may have been looking at, we're talking about things like these. These types of terracotta molded reliefs were also extremely popular at this time. And here we see these beautiful plaques depicting satyrs and maenads dancing. Part of Dionysiac ritual was dancing, drinking, you know, all of this sort of, again, removing that barrier between your thoughtful self and the self that could engage with the divine. And so these figures are, again, informing the work of the Ballets Russes. Now, if we move to this is the first time this piece has ever been on exhibit. And at first it might just look like some notes on a page. But one of the things that was a struggle was that dance notation, most of the pieces done by the Ballets Russes do not have any notation associated with them. There was a form of notation that was used in Russia, but not called Stepanov notation, but that was not utilized heavily. So the dances were passed down from dancer and ballet master to the next person. However, Nijinsky himself had his own method of dance notation, which was highly idiosyncratic, and until the 80s, no one could decipher. So it's not until two scholars in the 80s, using new documents, were able to actually decode what Nijinsky's dance notation said. One of the dance scholars who we worked with said something that I thought was really moving about some of this notation. So Nijinsky, unfortunately, has a very short career with the Ballets Russes and dancing in general. He's with the Ballets Russes as the principal dancer until 1913. It's only about 4 years. At that point, he starts to sort of decline and experiences mental health issues. He really loses the ability to dance after a few years after that. And so someone told me that they felt that a lot of this notation that he does after that period is a way of him sort of dancing on a page, him maintaining this thing that was so critical to his identity, so critical to his life, but he's no longer able to do. So this piece always I found very sort of moving. Okay, so talking a little bit more about costumes. Here we have a costume for the ballet Cleopatra. One of the things that the ancient world, or the sort of ancient world allowed them to explore was sort of women as powerful or as possessions. We see in Fawn that the women are nymphs. They're sort of not very, they don't sort of have very strong personalities. They're sort of one of a group. Whereas in Cleopatra, we see this sort of transgressive image of the powerful woman, the seductress, and so Botts here is using, he's using, images that come directly from ancient Egyptian reliefs, but also this incredible color. I mean, the Egyptians didn't use polka dots, so that's sort of another modern addition. But we can see how theatrical these costumes were and how colorful. But also we see that the ballets could have introduced different styles in one. So here we have a costume sketch by the artist Sonya Delaney, who's an orifice painter. And we can see how she's taken the geometric nature of Egyptian art and kind of emphasized it. And so she has really driven that home in this piece. We see then her husband, Robert Delaunay, some of the sets for the original Cleopatra, which were done by Botts, burned in a fire. And so this piece is an example of the second iteration of sets for that. But again, we see this that's very embedded in the modernist painting movements of the time, but very, but sort of still keeping the pyramids, the bull, the lotiform columns, and all those things that could read as Egyptian. This is what the Sonya Delaney costume looked like when it was actually produced. And I love everything about this image. You get real, and this costume actually still exists, and it exists in the collection of LACMA in LA. And it's just as colorful and spectacular as you'd expect. But what you can see here, and I've paired it with a Middle Kingdom relief of a goddess, where you can see that they've taken the nechbet, the vulture headdress, which was a typical part of either goddess and later some queen's regalia, and then just sort of taken the forms but altered them to become something sort of flatter. And so we see how that sort of translation can happen. I just wanted to show this, this piece to refer to the fact that this was about showmanship. This was about publicity. And here we have a publicity photo of the dancer Flora Valles in the title role of Cleopatra. And here she is posing with a snake from the Bronx Zoo as part of sort of the promotion of the upcoming ballet. I'm going to actually pass through this since we've already gotten to speak a bit about Isadora Duncan. So now we're going to move into some of the things we think about the ancient world and dance in the ancient world. Here we have a hydria, or a water jar, and on the shoulder we see this image, this line of figures dancing. It's not clear whether or not these are male dancers or male dancers dressed as female, as women. But the images like this sort of speak to the theatrical manifestation of dance in the ancient world, but again, they're a bit elusive. It's difficult for us to say exactly what type of dance this is, exactly in what context it would have been done. But here we have a really beautiful libation bowl that shows priestesses, probably dancing or moving in unison toward or around an altar. And this also sort of gives us a sense of the challenges of representing dance in 2 dimensions. You know, we sort of have to wrestle with that problem. Moving on, I wanted to give you a sense of the sets that Bakst created. So this is a watercolor of the set that was used for Daphnis and Chloe. And what I want to point out to you is that when it's huge, it really has this extremely loose and painterly quality. So you can imagine that the dancers kind of activate this environment, and that they sort of, it's like they're dancing in a painting. You know, this had a very sort of, in this case, a very ethereal, a very sort of imaginative quality. And I also wanted to show how Bakst used things that we may not at first expect. This piece here, which is a costume design for a woman from the village from Daphnis and Chloe, we see this kind of unusual silhouette manifest here. And one of the things that he's looking at are pre-Hellenic, extremely early Mycenaean figures called Psi and Phi idols, where we can see that he's taken the silhouette of these figures and then made them modern and you know, in this incredible costume. Also, we can see borrowing very directly from excavations of the time. So on the right, you see a jar from the tomb of Senegem. This piece and many like it were excavated in the late 1880s. And you can see that when we're looking at set pieces that he created for Phaedra, which is another later ballet, we can see that he's really drawing pretty directly on ancient material. The final thing that I'm going to just reference is the way in which ancient material could be used in a modern context. So what we see here is the art of Giorgio de Chirico, who many of us may be familiar with for doing these kind of very strange, desolate, creepy, to some degree, images of piazzas and with ancient architecture in them and things like that. Here, these were done for a ballet called La Ball, and La Ball did not take place in the ancient world. Instead, it was sort of, the story was that there's a party and there's a bunch of sort of mistaken identity, and it's very confusing. And so what de Chirico did was take the sort of classical architecture and map it onto the body, so that the dancers sort of started to become confused with the sets, and it kind of created that sense of disorientation. So the way in which the ancient world could be used changed a great deal over the course of the Ballet Russe. And this is a picture of the installation in the exhibition. And this is one of, I wish that I had some column pants, so I have to end with that. We want to thank all of our donors and lenders to the exhibition, and if you'd like to know more, we are happy to share our catalog with you. And if you have any, I'm sorry, I think I went a bit over. If we have any time, I can answer questions. So I'll pass it back to Iris.
Hi, everyone, again, and thank you, Claire. It's interesting because for us, this exhibition actually happened last year. So it's time traveling in many different ways. And I missed this exhibition because it was so beautiful. We also want to quickly mention that this whole concept that Claire spoke about of the ancient inspiring the modern, for this exhibition, we had the pleasure to collaborate with a lot of different institutions. Claire gave a talk at the Maison Française downtown. We also collaborated with the Guggenheim's Works in Process, and we had a performance in the spring, or they did a performance in the spring inspired by the exhibition, where the costumes, the movements, the music were all inspired by the exhibition. And we're happy to share with you a link to the video, to the recording of that performance at the Guggenheim. So I'm gonna paste it into the chat for everyone to see. It's an hour long, and what it is it's there's a panel discussion and then the actual dance performance, panel discussion and then the dance performance, where they speak with both the choreographers and the costume designers about how the exhibition inspired them and how they're inspired in different ways. It's beautiful. There's some New York City Ballet and American Ballet Theater dancers in it, and you should definitely check it out when you have time. It's an hour long, and it's interesting visually. It's interesting to learn about their creative process, and it's beautiful dances and costumes as well. So I'm gonna type that in to the chat while we start answering some questions. First, we have a question from Maria Molinari asking if there was any influence of the Ballets Russes on Martha Graham. That Martha Graham herself was also very influenced by the ancient world, and the question just about other people who may have been inspired. So,
yeah. So Martha Graham, I think that part of the thing that, and I would certainly defer to a ballet scholar above myself on this, but I think that one of the things is that, of course, what we're seeing here is a tremendous amount of cross-pollination that was happening. So, far from being sort of a straight line where we're looking at, Duncan to Ballets Russes to Graham, that these things were all sort of in the mix together. The Ballets Russes certainly influenced sort of, and Duncan influenced Graham's approach. But I think that what she asked of the ancient world in some ways was quite similar to what the Ballets Russes and Duncan were asking, kind of for something that was organic, natural, truthful, and again, whether or not that's actually, we can read that into the ancient world is another question, but that was something that was meaningful at the time to them.
We have another question, which is a little bit, I know this isn't your area of expertise, but about the modern history, just why the Ballets Russes left Russia.
Russia, of course, starting with the revolution of 1905, which was sort of a prelude to the Russian Revolution and lead up to World War I, was a place that was, becoming politically very difficult for people to live in. Diaghilev, himself, had been early in his career, had been kind of involved in facilitating cultural exchange between Russia and Paris in service of a kind of Franco-Russian political connection. But then, that becomes untenable, and he and most of the dancers leave for Paris. They also, the Ballets Russes actually kind of starts though during the summer holiday or the break from the Imperial Ballet. And so many of those dancers sort of went to go do that and then become enmeshed in the Ballets Russes. But Paris also was such a sort of hotbed of creativity and such an active place to be at that moment that I think it just sort of, it's in some ways, I think that Paris really is the bigger, I shouldn't say that. I mean, Paris is just a huge part of that story. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
I think it is. And a pretty simple question coming from Gail. Was it Delaney or Basked or someone else who designed the Cleopatra?
The kind of what we think of, yeah. That piece is Delaney. Box's design for Cleopatra was the one that Flora Valles was wearing in the, I can go back to it, in the snake picture. So sort of more similar in concept to the costume that I showed with the polka dots. So what's interesting is that if you've seen Delaney's painting, this is very similar to the way that she kind of looks at material. So I think that, if you put her in context, but this one is, is Delaney. And this is what Boxed created for Cleopatra.
I think we have maybe time for one or two more questions. One question is talking about music in the ancient world, because you brought it up in the very beginning of your presentation about, obviously not having recordings or anything like that. But do you have any, can you say anything about the musical instruments that have survived and what people have done to sort of put it into context
Yeah, so, this is a really interesting issue, and certainly there are ethnomusicologists who work on not only sort of the capacity of different types of instruments, but also trying to trace perhaps connections to, extant cultures that might relate to the ancient world. What we see an awful lot are, in some ways the same types of instruments that we might think of today. So percussion instruments are certainly a big piece, and so we can also imagine that there's a real idea of like sort of keeping time and things like that. String instruments, also certainly are in existence, and then wind, some flutes, panpipes, things like that, and we see some of those. If we actually go back to one of the pieces here, sorry, hopefully nobody gets nauseous as I zoom through this, but you can see here, sorry, there's a little bit of a delay. So here we can see sort of some of the types of instruments that people would have used, bells, all different sorts of things. But in terms of kind of reconstructing what these things might have sounded like in terms of melody and things like that, we were really a bit at a loss.
So maybe it's a nice question to end on. We have one more question from Norbert. It's a large question, but it might give you a chance to kind of wrap this presentation up nicely. Norbert asks, was ancient dance religious or secular?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Dance was, I think that part of the thing that we have now is this really strong division, or many times a very strong division between what is secular and what is religious. Whereas I think that probably that distinction is a little bit, is not so strong in the ancient world. So for example, if you were to, a major part of the social life is engagement in festival and ritual. Dance would be part of that, a very important part of that, and certainly would both facilitate social engagement, but also be in service, in sort of adoration of the god. And there are texts that talk about, the gods like music, they like dancing, they like, this is something you're doing to please and I think particularly in the case of the Dionysiac, in to sort of break down those barriers between this world and the divine world. So I think that the answer to that is both, but that I think that distinction is maybe less sort of stringent than we might think. You can picture also the fact that especially in Greece, let's say, but in a lot of ancient cultures, you would not have a terrible, especially women would not have a terrible amount of interaction in the sort of outside world. You're not engaged in maybe all of the different parts of life, and so going to religious festivals and things would have been an opportunity for you to see people, engage with people, which is a major part of sort of social movement, I guess.
Well, I think we're wrapping up now, just on the dot of 2 o'clock. So I'll say thank you, Claire. Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you, everyone who commented and sent in questions. This obviously could go on for hours because there's so many just interesting things to talk about the ancient world and what we consider modern world, in that it's only less than 1,000 years old. So thank you, and hopefully we'll be able to have another virtual tour webinar with ISAW sometime soon.
I love that.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.